Hey guys, I'm going to walk you through how I made these monster live edge cutting boards. Let's get started. Instead of using a router sled to level these out, I'm actually going to use an angle grinder. I just ordered the pad for the angle grinder, and I'm going to start with about a 40 grit just to knock the rough saw marks off. So the key to using the angle grinder is keeping it level, especially when you're using 40 grit. You do not want to gouge your wood and actually make a big dent in it that you'll have to sand out. And as you can see, it does a great job on getting rid of those really deep saw marks left by the bandsaw. And once I get everything knocked down with that 40 grit, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the 80. This is going to smooth it up a little bit more. It's going to be a little easier to keep level and a little easier to handle. And I'm going to do this with both slabs. And once I get it to a point that I think that my hand sanders can handle it, then I'm done with the angle grinder. For these two builds, I'm actually using walnut and something that we call caramel ash around here. Just has the mineral grains or the mineral stains in the wood, which create beautiful furniture, or in this case, cutting boards. So from this point, I've started off with the 120 grit with the hand sander, and you notice that I've placed my pencil lines out. This is just so I can tell where I have sanded and if there's any high or low spots in my material. And so for this board, I'm just smoothing everything out to where I can actually get ready to install my inlays. Now I actually have a video on how to make this jig and how to easily cut bow ties for inlays. If you're interested in something like that, you can check it out. Now, I'm not quite ready to install these inlays, but I want to go ahead and get them laid out. I actually have a short video on how to install butterfly inlays if you're new to that. But what you're seeing me do is mark and score the outline of each of these inlays just so I know the placement. Now it's time to go ahead and cut our handles for the bottom of these monsters. I actually made a little simple router jig to make sure that the handle sizes were the same all the way around for all of these. You really don't even have to do this. If you're pretty good at freehanding, you can freehand this. But since we're going to be making several passes, this jig just seemed to help to speed things up a bit and keep things more uniform. And I'm only going to take about a quarter of an inch off at a time, just using a straight bit for my router. So it really depends on the size of your board on how large you want your handles and how deep they have to be. And now let's turn these back over and get these inlays in. As you can tell, this is one of my favorite parts. And what I'm doing here is just using a straight bit to remove some of the inside of my layouts for my bow ties. Just try to make sure you don't get too close to the line. That way you have plenty of room to do your chisel work to make those nice and straight. All right, now we're just gluing up our bow tie inlays. I like to use a lot of glue, and I like to make my inlays pretty thick, and I'll clean those up just here in a bit. So I always save any of the dust from any species like walnut or cherry to kind of go around and help fill in any of the voids that there may be little nicks, whenever you're chiseling out your bow ties. I'm just using a pull saw here just to level everything up. You don't have to use a pull saw. You can use a flush cut saw. You can use a router, however you would like. And at this point, it really doesn't matter if you get a few scratches on your board because we have a lot of sanding to do from this point. And I'm just going to sand this down to the level of the board. It doesn't have to be perfect just yet, but it'll be ready for our finished sanding when we get to that point. Okay, so for both of these boards, I'm going to be using epoxy resin just to fill the knot holes and cracks. So we want to make sure to clean those out pretty well and get everything taped up and ready for your epoxy. So for this, I really needed to use a deep pour epoxy. The only thing that I had on hand was tabletop, so I'm limited to about a quarter of an inch at a time. And as you can see, I've moved this indoors to help to control the environment. Keep in mind, for all epoxy resin, you pretty much need to stay between 72 and 80 degrees for it to set correctly. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a farm syringe to inject black epoxy into the cracks on this board. Since the top coat will not be epoxy resin, it will have to be some type of food grade oil. I do not want food or anything like that to get down in these cracks. So if your live edge board is going to need epoxy, after that is all done, we'll move back out to our workshop. And what I'm going to do, since these boards are so large, that I'm going to install furniture levelers just so you can actually tilt the board if you would like, depending on what you're cutting. And you know, this step really isn't necessary. I just thought it would be a nice touch for such a large project. And now you can see me doing the exact same thing on the walnut. The levelers do not have to be perfectly spaced, but I'm just marking them out from the handles. And now it is time to sand. And like before, I'm going to go ahead and mark my board with a pencil. And I'm actually going to be using a 120 grit to start with this sanding, since we pretty much ended the pre-sand, at 120. And I'm going to start by working across the grain, basically just leveling everything out and getting a nice smooth edge. I'll do the same for the ends as I go through these different grits. The ends and the sides will be sanded as well. And here's another preference. For these particular live edge boards, I wanted to keep the bark on. I thought it would make for a really nice look. And because the bark was so tight, I would be able to seal them pretty easily. So we fast forwarded through some of our sanding cycles, which I'll go over just shortly. We're up to our 320, and this is going to be getting pretty slick by now. I'm going to be doing the same for the walnut, and make sure to hit the back. It doesn't have to be as perfect as the front, but it does need to be sanded as well. For the handles, you may need to use a mouse sander or a Dremel tool to get into the corners. So at the 320 stage, I water pop the grain on both of these boards so I can sand that grain down to smooth. So starting outside, we started with 40 grit and then the 80. Now once we went inside, we went to our 120 grit and then up to our 240 grit. And then from there, we went to the 320. And then we went up to our 600. And from there, I like to finish it out with a nice 800. By this time, it is smooth. And now it is time to condition the board. I'm actually using mineral oil. There are several different types of board oils that you can use. But just make sure to coat everything evenly on all sides and recoat over the next couple of days. And as the final step, I like to use a board conditioner that has beeswax mixed into the oil, just to help to protect and keep the board from drying out as quickly. So after several coats of oil and the conditioner to finalize, it actually looks like that it has a finish applied to it, but it's actually just food grade oil. And the final product is unique and one of a kind. Well guys, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, let me know. Until next time, stay creative and always think outside the box.